Hey everyone, Happy New Year. I think you can probably tell there's been some changes, and I think it would be wrong to not address some of those changes. So, first of all, yes, the fringe on my hair is green now, and that's partially an explainer of why we're in my living room with the cute clown pillow and also the floor mirror. Don't ask about the floor mirror. Just ignore the floor mirror for now. And now that I've called attention to it, you're all going to talk about the floor mirror. But anyway, I have a new setup now. I use this setup for streaming, but it is an extremely good gaming computer that also renders video really well and audio really well. And as you know, I render a lot of video and I render a lot of audio too. So a lot of people specifically gave a lot to make this possible, mainly to make this possible. But one particular person who goes by the handle Jamtapot, they know who they are, basically donated to me a computer that was built except for the graphics card. And despite some difficulties actually fitting the graphics card into the case, it's here. And so all of this is because of those people who donated and who got me to dye my hair and gave me the computer. I still haven't figured out like what an appropriate reward is for Jamtapot. I feel like some kind of lifetime membership to all of the paywalled stuff or something. But that's, you know what, they can make that demand in the comments if they watch this, you know? That's good incentive. You can ask of me one boon, Jamtapot, and I might grant it if it's like something reasonable. I'm not gonna. I've already promised to eat crayons because of this new computer. So, and yeah, look, we're just gonna have to move past it now and get into the actual video. But Happy New Year! Thanks for all of these stuff, and we're gonna see how this new setup actually works for recording videos. Basically, wanted to say thanks to all the people who contributed to this and well, there aren't any crayons here yet, but future crayon consumption. I think if you ask people who should we help first, in as broad a way as possible, people would generally say the people who need the most help. That's a good instinct. The problems of a child being starved by the political class are probably more urgent than a millionaire's problems. I mean, I assume they have problems, right? I'm making this point because I want people to understand that I believe that the instinct behind a lot of the things we're going to be talking about is often expressed with good intentions. We know where that road leads to, though. That's what I wanted to look at today. This video was meant to be out in December, and the whole gimmick was going to be me dressed as Santa Claus, giving out free stuff, but instead you have to settle for this. Me looking normal, well, you know, as normal as I do usually look, telling you about why the often good intentions behind some of these sentiments are misguided in a lot of cases. Particularly when we already have universal provision in areas where this type of argument can be expanded into, and they are quite vulnerable to this kind of argument. There are certain justifications provided for acting on this instinct that on the surface may seem quite reasonable. You might even have believed them yourself at some point, or still believe in them to some extent in some areas. You might be about to post a very long comment that I won't read about how means testing is awesome, and before you do that, I would say, listen to what I have to say in the video. If you still think it's awesome, then you get to post the very long comment. I'm still not going to read it, though. I don't just want to argue against something, though, but for some kind of alternative, some potential alternative to the weird bureaucracy-laden hellscape that we're building for ourselves. We're all potentially one bad day away from needing support to live our lives, and that can take many forms. Given that, I think it's maybe pretty important that the safety net that we build as a society is as strong and as wide as possible. First, though, I want to think about why some people seem determined or really strongly believe that that safety net should be as narrow and specifically applied as possible. I would say weak. They wouldn't say that, but I would say weak. And a lot of them don't even think that's what they're doing. In a lot of the world, there's a general consensus about the areas where we accept universal provision of certain services. I hate calling them that, but that is generally what we call them. For example, in most countries in the world, some kind of compulsory education is imposed by the government. In the UK, when I was growing up, you had to go to school until you were 16 years old, and you didn't have to pay for it. At least not for, like, the education part. My school had a school uniform that was terrible, and you had to buy all sorts of other stuff, like a PE kit. But at least in theory, I could show up for free and get taught fractions or about Shakespeare for free until I was 16. Which was good. I mean, it gave me something to do during the day, and now I can do fractions. Which, I suppose, given that I have a master's degree, is not that impressive nowadays. My parents could have paid for me to attend a private school, I guess. And given how I turned out, I suspect their reaction, if they had put that money in, would have been something like,
I am never going to financially recover from this.
But the fact is that even if they could have theoretically afforded it, they weren't compelled to send me to one just because they earned a bit more than other people. That's a good thing for a lot of reasons. Literacy is like magic. It changes a lot about a person's life, and a more educated population means that there's a wider base of potential made available for all humanity. I guess you can also make a more educated population means more or better economic growth argument, but I'm less interested in that because I don't care. Than I am in the fact that life is so much better when you and the people around you can read. Another example of where most societies seem to have agreed that something should be provided is healthcare. And no, I'm not just bringing it up to make fun of the Americans for not having universal healthcare. But if we're being honest about it, the American healthcare system is bad. I know that was really controversial of me to say, but it is. If you compare it to similar countries, in a lot of those comparisons, it is the worst overall. Has some areas where it does a little better than others, but it is, generally speaking, the worst. It stands to reason that the ability to access healthcare is good, and that as people we have a right to be able to access the things we need to live healthier lives. That being healthier shouldn't be determined by wealth, or knowing a doctor personally, or being born in the right place. There's also, theoretically at least, the advantage that universal provision of healthcare means that preventable, treatable, and contagious diseases proliferate less widely through society. And yes, I am aware of how Britain did during the COVID pandemic, but that is, at least in theory, how it is supposed to work. And that means that people are healthier, happier, and can do the things that they want to do for longer. I don't want to live surrounded by people carrying the plague or who are dying of dysentery. So I'm pretty pro-universal healthcare, and generally speaking, most people seem to be, and most governments seem to provide a system like that. There are some areas in the UK, at least, where we don't provide universal access to benefits or services. Sometimes this isn't necessarily malicious or strictly means testing as we commonly imagine it, because eligibility doesn't primarily relate to the means a particular individual or family has at their disposal, or household. I think UK benefits are done more by household than by individual. I guess if you're on your own in a household, then that's the same thing. Anyway, to give an example, the UK has something called the Personal Independence Payment, which is a payment given to people with long-term disabilities that is available for everyone who meets the criteria. And to take the term universal, that's like most literal, I do not get personal independence payment because I do not qualify, so it's not universal. I'm being obtuse to illustrate a point that eligibility criteria doesn't necessarily equal means testing, just so that we don't get confused going forward. It's also an illustration that the idea that the people who need help should be helped first is a logic that's surprisingly easy to justify. Well, maybe not surprisingly easy. I'm not sure why I would say it's surprising. Now, in the UK, as we'll see in a little bit, this has not worked in practice as well as it does in theory. An example of an area where we in the UK don't believe in universal provision and access is university education. Is this me being salty about my student loan debt? A little, but because of the coalition government's decision to increase tuition fees to £9,000, It became a live political issue, led to the destruction of at least one political party as a major national force, and means I can now show you this absurd balance I racked up for the crime of wanting to study physics. Yeah, I'm sure I'll get around to repaying this in full at some point. My god. A lot of arguments around this as a live political issue have involved the kind of arguments we see in the wider means testing discourse. There are more reasons why this was pushed, like the marketization of higher education and so on. That's not quite the focus of the video here. Those arguments tend to take this kind of shape. Why should a middle-income taxpayer pay for the child of a rich person to go to university? And this has the facade of being kind of reasonable, if you don't really think about it for too long and go by the instinct that it feels unfair. Why should I, literally me, a person who earns, depending on the specific data you believe, just over or just under the median income, pay for a person who earns 3, 4, 5, 6 times as much as me's kid to go to university? Well, part of the reason is that there aren't that many of them, and I'd rather, I think the benefit of it is that more people get to go to university without having 50-something thousand pounds worth of debt. Or to bring it to benefits like universal credit, which is a means-tested benefit in the UK, which is also a huge fiasco, but let's just sort of park that for 1 second while we use it as an example. Why should a person with a lot of savings, who happens to meet the other eligibility criteria, get benefits? If they have savings, they should spend that before the state intervenes, just to ensure the most efficient use of state support, right? If you don't think about it, and you'll notice that's kind of crucial for a lot of this logic, that seems fair enough, or at least not maliciously intended. The thing that gets me about this is it seems to require you to believe some things that I don't think are true. Firstly, it seems to require you to believe that the primary beneficiary of things like free university education or cold hard cash from the government is the person who receives it. And that's not true. They're not the sole beneficiary, right? Primary, maybe, but sole, absolutely not. It's untrue by almost any lens of analysis you choose to apply to it. It also requires you to believe that this is simply a better way of doing things, which, if you take means testing benefits, is an interesting question. Not to spoil too much, but there are definitely some drawbacks to this that universalism doesn't have. The other angle that people tend to come at this from is this way of providing some services and benefits is more credible politically because it has the appearance of fairness. And well, wait until I tell you about who gets dissuaded from accessing things that they're entitled to under this system. And yes, there is this argument that, oh, if you can't be bothered to access it, you don't actually need it. That is not usually the reason people bounce off means-tested systems. They usually bounce off it because of stigma and complexity. But we'll sort of talk about that more later. One aspect of means testing and anti-universalist principles that surprises me is just how broadly supported they are across the political spectrum, and how many justifications you can run into. Because there are a variety of logics that underpin this that you can make appealing to almost any political tendency. But in the interest of not talking for over an hour about this, I'm going to focus on a handful of them and attach them to the part of the political spectrum that, in my experience, espouses them. They aren't mutually exclusive, they don't just belong to one group, and people do tend to just pick and choose as convenient. But it's more fun for me to blame specific groups. Well, particularly one specific group, it turns out. So that's what we're doing. We're just going to have to make our peace with it. I think the most insidious one is this idea of value for money that's become very fashionable to talk about, especially when you're talking about taxpayers' money. Like, people talk about taxpayers' money like it's special money, that by virtue of being taxed, it must be spent in the most ruthlessly efficient way possible. And you tended to see this from the right and the right-wing press, but as the centre in the UK has become more alienated from the left, and, you know, they don't even bother stealing the rhetoric of the left anymore, which, come on, even the right understands that this is an effective thing to do. But anyway, as an on-the-record advocate for and defender of inefficiency, I do want to say that trying to make processes run better or more cheaply isn't always a secret plot to make poor people fill in forms or disabled people go through humiliating assessments over and over and over again. But this language is often brought up in order to justify bringing in bureaucracy to ensure that the money's going to where it needs to go, like Rachel Reeves in her Office for Value for Money, which I've probably thrown up screenshots about already, which couldn't have been more perfectly named for this video. So thank you, Rachel Reeves. That's the only time I'll ever thank her. But there you go, I guess it's happened now. Another form of the argument comes from that instinct I mentioned earlier, but the people who need the help should be the first to receive it. Therefore, shouldn't people who can afford to get private healthcare or education or who have enough savings to live off just pay for those things and live off their savings? One example that sprang to mind as I was writing, I just hit the microphone, but as I was writing, was the issue of free school meals, which people get really kind of deranged about. There's a category of person who seems to sincerely believe that kids should get charged for lunch because what if a rich person's child gets a free lunch? To which I'd say, and this is basically the crux of the video, who the fuck cares as long as kids are fed? Sorry, I am getting ahead of myself, but that particular debate really irritates me. That line of argument is particularly awful because it's a very right-wing idea masquerading as social democratic principle. Well, social democratic in the modern sense. I don't want to besmirch the good name of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party by associating them with ghouls like Wes Streeting, a far greater criminal than any member of that party ever became. The point is that this logic is really dangerous, especially if you see people who self-identify as the furthest left acceptable point in public discourse going along with it. Then there's the twin horrors of centre-leftists in particular. The first is that choosing to not provide services to means test to concede to narratives like the one that we spoke about just now, and just generally accepting the right-wing understanding of all these things. But all of this is somehow grown up. I fucking hate that shit. I did a whole video a while ago that touched on this, but nothing tells me you're gonna cry about being called right-wing for being right-wing than claiming you're a grown-up. The people saying this are usually older than me, like 40 to 50 years old, and yeah, you should be a grown-up. Your hairline's receded and your kids are about to go to uni. Of course you're a grown-up. Stop saying this shit. Gonna just take a moment there. The other horror is the idea of tough choices. Now, do I get that you have to choose your priorities? Like, when I go shopping, do I need to prioritize the things that I need to make dinner over, say, pistachio panettones? Now, it turns out I usually buy both. I'd almost understand if we had a situation where the government didn't literally own the money factory and their budgets were actually like a household budget. Then we might need to have this conversation. But it does own the money factory and its budgets don't work like that. Basically, if you ever hear someone talk about tough choices, get ready for the tough choice to be something that almost exclusively doesn't impact the political class or their future employment prospects after politics. You probably get the impression from the title of the video and the thumbnail and just the way I speak about the people who advocate for this stuff, I don't think it's good. In fact, I pretty much from top to bottom think this is a pretty rotten way of thinking. I want to look back on some of those justifications we just talked about and explain a little bit more about why I'm not convinced by them, which is probably the nicest way I can put it. Tough choices or tough decisions has just become this big thing that both parties love talking about in the UK. Both major parties, I should say. There's more than two parties. Not that it particularly matters. The thing is about tough choices and tough decisions, and I promise you this is not me just being direct for the sake of it. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. The decisions they make are never tough for them. The decisions that get given the cover of tough are never the ones that would feasibly impact the political class or the individuals who pile tons of money into the political parties. If you Google Rishi Sunak tough choices or Keir Starmer tough choices, you see lots and lots of news articles quoting them as saying that. And two that I found that were interesting were the tough choice of not completing the northern leg of HS2 by Rishi Sunak, which works as a tough choice because there's a big constituency in the press that just believe any government overspending is heresy, and that prioritizing public transport is some kind of like racially motivated attack on people who drive cars, which are now a race, I guess. I don't know. The British press have took leave of their senses long before this sort of stuff started happening. Naturally, this means that far from being a tough choice outside of alienating the tiny portion of Tories who take the train in the north of England, it's remarkably easy. I mean, Rishi Sunak doesn't use the train except for photo ops, where he looks like he's pointing at all the children Keir Starmer's going to be starving a bit later on. The other interesting case that came up was Keir Starmer deciding that backing the 2-child benefit cap was a tough decision he could get away with. For those who don't know, here's a handy excerpt from an article on Sky News that explains exactly what that is and how well that went for Keir Starmer. There has been a growing rift between Labour MPs and the leadership after Sir Keir revealed he would not scrap the Conservative policy that prevents parents claiming child benefits for any third or subsequent child born after April 2017. This to me highlights the danger of accepting the logic of tough choices if you're, say, a Social Democrat or leader of a Social Democratic Party, because this was a decision that got him labelled Sir Kid Starver, and while there's definitely a press demographic that is in favour of starving kids, it's pretty incredible to get the worst of someone else's kid-starving policy before you even got into government and can even take any credit for starving the kids. Now, that's some forensic centrist efficiency, I have to say. I have to give it to Keir Starmer sometimes. He really does nail it sometimes. I think it's also worth pointing out, and I know they didn't ask for it, but Keir Starmer is happy to hide behind him from criticism. Keir Starmer's kids were never at risk of starving because of an arbitrary cutoff. This decision doesn't even fit into the other logics or justifications at play, because 2 children is just so obviously a number they picked because they went, 2 parents, therefore 2 children, or some such stupid thing. And also because they want to punish poor people who want to have more kids. Because, you know, why not make an incredibly difficult undertaking even more difficult? Like, why not do that? So yeah, spare me the tough decisions bullshit. Because you know what would actually be a tough decision? Something that goes against the orthodoxy of the day. Take Trident, for example. You could scrap Trident and use that money to feed kids. And a lot of people are going to go, oh, but the year-to-year cost isn't so high and we need nukes. Why? Why do you need them? So some little Englander can cuddle their Winston Churchill plush and pretend we're still a superpower? I got news for pretty much everyone watching this video from the UK. The UK hasn't been a superpower since before you were born. Grow up and sort out your life. Also, do you know what superpowers usually manage to do? Make sure kids aren't starving. God, alright. The idea of being grown up is related to this way of thinking too. Like, the worst thing you can be called in British politics is like a student politician or engaging in student politics or some such thing. My issue with that is that it's a fallback for people who have no real political argument. Like, I'd get it if someone was saying, we're going to put a British astronaut on Mars, because why the fuck would you do that? Also, space sucks. I did a whole video about that. But yeah, it's true. Space is shitty. It sucks. Don't go there. Instead, we usually see it deployed against ideas like taxing the rich a little more and things like the Green New Deal, as you call it in America, or as we called it in England, the Green Industrial Revolution. Which, don't get me wrong, they have their flaws, but it's not like they were unfeasible moonshots, or Mars shots, I guess, based on the bit I was doing. The disconcerting thing is that parties and tendencies who are usually called out for not being grown up tend to just throw the grown up sort of thing back in the face of their accusers without really knowing that they're reinforcing this narrative. I won't linger on this too long because I did do a whole video ranting about this a while ago, but the idea that doing the right thing or good things isn't grown up is not reflective of my experience of grown-ups when I was a kid or of my own experience of being almost 30. That's not to say there aren't shitty grown-ups, to be clear. I almost feel bad because it does read like a pathology on the part of centrists and journalists, and like, I'm kind of kicking them when they're down. But also, if you use this to justify shitty policy, you do kind of deserve the kicking. Then there's the argument that the extent of means testing that's done in the UK and in other countries is somehow efficient. And also, I guess that the point needs to be made that if the bureaucracy is more expensive than just giving everyone the thing for free, then it's probably plainly not that efficient. It's almost ironic that this comes from the same people who decry government waste and then say that we need layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy that has to be paid for on top of the entire thing, because bureaucracy imparts complexity, and the act of having to seek entitlement through engaging in that can create shame, and shame is a powerful demotivator, which contributes to the big problem, which is that people who are entitled to these benefits often don't take them up. So not only is means testing inefficient, it's ineffective at the stated goal of targeting benefits. A cynic might say that this is the point of the argument of efficiency, which is that it's a Trojan horse to create acceptance from the center-left to the far-right for policies that prevent people claiming things they're entitled to, even under the unnecessary regime of means testing. Finally, there's the logic of, well, if they can afford it, let them pay for it. I think a lot of people who say this don't really consider what that means. I mean, we all remember the old expression, you get what you pay for. And if you extend that logic into the healthcare system, congratulations, you have just justified the American healthcare system, which, as we've established, is not good. The other aspect of this, and I should say this is anecdotal, it tends to be politicians who claim to have grown up working class who then pivot to this position. And I think there's a reason for that. Firstly, they remember the state assistance they got and how good it was, but also now that they're politicians, they make so much more money than their parents and that they probably ever imagined they could. I think they underestimate the cost of these things and just how far that can go. For example, people in the UK would never suggest that healthcare should be something that if you can afford it, you should pay for it. But if we accept that in one area, why don't we accept it there, right? We accept it in all sorts of other things, right? And if the argument is that because we benefit as a society from people being able to be healthy, then do we not benefit from people being educated or trained? This isn't to make a crude, slippery slope argument, but to warn against accepting the premise of people opposed to providing anything at all. This is how you end up with like a series of subscription services, but instead of it being like Netflix, Spotify, and if you're a massive loser, a blue tick on Twitter, it's the NHS, your kid's school, and a service to put out the fire. There are, of course, serious issues with means testing beyond the people who annoy me being annoying about it. One of them is that bureaucracy that is needed to enforce it and confirm that the right people are getting the benefits or access are themselves pretty expensive. Anything that requires people to do work is going to start stacking up quite significant expenses quite quickly. And that means even if you catch someone claiming something they're not meant to, you're usually not making the money back that you invested into it, at least at a certain point. Like, the law of diminishing returns is a thing here. One of the things this leads to is a societal stigma, one which leads to less uptake because people in societies where we unfairly regard one's ability to live totally independently as a virtue feel like failures. If you've been in that kind of situation, you know how badly that stings. This stigma also creates a hyper-focus on people who may be cheating the system. I remember these deranged adverts that would be on TV when I was a kid that tried to scare so-called benefit cheats. I'll throw one in here, because I'm sure they're on YouTube somewhere.
We know when and where you're most likely to consider committing benefit fraud. If you claim you're living alone and you're not, we can check your bills. If we think you're committing benefit fraud, we can come out and pay you a visit.
Part of me believes this was just tough guy posturing, but this did feed into a culture that I'm ashamed to say that when I was younger, even I fell into. You know, jokes revolving around the show Benefit Street, which if you don't know what that is, just spare yourself. They were pretty common though, the jokes. A real manifestation of the ugliness of austerity, which is tied into this whole thing. There's also the cascading consequences of such a punitive system that's designed, in my view, to prevent people seeking benefits, services, and support which they're entitled to, which is that vulnerable people are often disproportionately the victim of it. Now, I was chatting with my graphics guy about the video idea and the thumbnail and so on. The idea of eugenics came up more than once, and it was actually a really good note on the script, and it's why I'm glad I have such a great graphics guy. Shout out to Emma. I'll do another shout out later, but he deserved the plaudits for this sort of line of thought. And while I think the austerity regime itself is an exercise that leads itself and lends itself to eugenicist goals, one of the results of it, incidentally, was that the UK has been condemned by the UN multiple times now for violating the human rights of disabled people. Whether that fits into a video that's means testing, strictly about means testing, I'm not quite sure. But it is important to note that these stigmas, the difficulty engaging with the forms and the bureaucracy and so on, required to access these benefits due to the means testing regime and just callous disregard from the general public that's been fostered by the existence of these measures adds up. I want to pivot away from thinking about targeted benefits and means testing in that area for a second to just think about services. What happens if we say free school meals are just for the poorest, or free bus passes are only for a specific group within a particular demographic? Or if we have private alternatives to university provided things like in healthcare and education? What it does is it serves to divest part of society from those institutions. Now, in the case of the very rich, the very, very, very rich, they're probably never going to be particularly invested in state schools or the NHS because they're rich. They'll have parallel provision that they pay for. That does cause some problems, though, when we meet the if someone can pay, they should pay logic, because that's not just the very rich who may have outsized influence on their own, but on their own, they can't dismantle a behemoth like the NHS. The problem comes when this extends to politically significant demographics. Whether we like it or not, a lot does hinge on this sort of middle-class-ish type that's, annoying, lives in their big house, has 2 cars, whatever, stereotypical dickhead. And when they're detached from benefits and the provision of services, they don't care about them as much. Think about how much more salience Britain's extremely harsh benefit system had in the public consciousness the second a load of lower middle class people had to deal with it during the initial stages of the COVID pandemic. It's no coincidence that the satisfaction rose once they came into contact with it. The same principle applies to the NHS. As waiting times have become worse due to a combination of poor funding, bad working conditions, a recruitment crisis, and privatisation, people have been encouraged to skip the queue and go private. This has a couple of effects. Firstly, creating demand for private healthcare draws doctors away from public healthcare because, they need to feed their families too, and if you're going to get paid a bunch more for the same job, why wouldn't you just do that job? And the other is that it detaches people who can afford it from the public provision of the service. It opens the door to more of these problems because they're so detached from it. They don't act on it in a political way, and so it becomes a vicious spiral. It's not that hard to extend this thought to all areas, and I think it's obvious, at least from what I think I've presented to you, that this doesn't really work the way people want it to or the way that they say it does. So what is the alternative? I want to start from the easiest stuff to talk about when we sort of think about what do we do about this, because it's easy for one, and I think these cases are largely self-evident. There are things that we all benefit from even if we don't directly get the thing on offer. Like public healthcare, for one. I like living in a country where people who fall ill can get treated for free. And despite everything the Tories and admittedly Labour before them have done to the NHS, it can get the job done, and it can certainly be improved. I mean, if there was a government that wasn't deliberately damaging it. The other plainly obvious example I could think of, just off the top of my head, although it is scripted, so it's not off the top of my head, but off the top of my head when I was writing, was firefighting. I don't think a system of, your house is on fire, better call the premium fire department to make sure they get here faster than the fire department bronze, or whatever we'd call it. I don't think that's a good system. Cities going up in flames because someone couldn't afford to call a fire engine, or because there wasn't someone poor enough for the free fire engine, is clearly, not gonna work. And to be clear, no one's advocating privatizing the fire service. At least I don't think. Maybe some people are. I don't know. I didn't find anyone saying that. But if there is someone saying we should means test the fire department or privatize it or something, no. Just no. That's such a horrible idea. Just simply look up any instance of someone trying this ever. I imagine it didn't go very well. The other example is lifelong education. I know this is a controversial thing to suggest in the UK, but you benefit from other people getting university and other forms of education. Yes, even the stuff you think isn't serious or going to get you a job. Take it from me. I did a degree that gets you a job, and I struggled to find work in my early mid-20s. I only got my current job after a 3 to 4 year long search for full-time work. I also just think that studying a thing you enjoy is probably the right choice. If there's one piece of advice I want to give to anyone who may be about to go to uni who's watching this, and I don't know if that's a big part of my audience, but just in case, don't make my mistake. I doubled and tripled down on physics after I stopped being interested in it, and while I got away with it, I paid for it, literally and figuratively. Either way, it's clear that I just think these things should be free for everybody. Don't make people pay to get fires put out. I mean, no one's seriously suggesting that as a policy, but in this country it's a good idea to get ahead of these things. Next area to think about are the means-tested and targeted benefits. I want to take this opportunity to say that, just as an example, benefits that are targeted to parents, or I guess their children via the parents, or the disabled are in principle fine, as long as everyone within those groups is eligible. None of this two-child cap bullshit we have at the moment, and we definitely should not be subjecting people to humiliating assessments all the goddamn time about it. Or at all, really. They should also be enough to meaningfully support these people and not just a token amount that we give to just make ourselves look like we're doing something, as is currently the case, because the amount of money you get for these things is not very high. Otherwise, with things like universal credit, the means testing doesn't really achieve its stated goal. What it does do is it achieves its unspoken goal, reducing uptake and inflicting cruelty and tedium on people who need help. There have been experiments with things like UBI, and there are some trials that have been planned and some that have been done, and UBI, and indeed the point should be made, more generous benefits, make people who receive them happier and raise their living standards. And actually it does seem to have a cascading effect that it makes everyone else happier. Now, there are potential pitfalls here, and UBI on its own isn't a panacea because explosive assholes still exist, like landlords. So it's not the universal basic part of UBI that's the issue, but the I part. Instead, I would propose that you look at a system that is colloquially called Universal Basic Services as a starting point. Things that could be included under the umbrella of basic services are things like food and water, which is the kind of thing that the CEO of Nestle would consider extreme, which I would say in the current political environment, sure, but then you have to consider this. You need food and water to live. And the provision of food by the state is something that's been done for a long time and by a variety of governments. I mean, Rome had the grain dole, which eliminated a significant expense for a lot of people at the time. Speaking of significant expenses, you could, for example, take a look at housing. That's another thing we need to live, or at least live healthily in a lot of cases, and perhaps a system of high-quality housing stock to meet various needs being held in state or collective ownership that's given to those who need it would be good, actually. It'd certainly change a lot of people's lives if such a thing was available, and I say this like we didn't have council houses in the UK, but the conditions of this country kind of force me to talk about it like it's like a deep, mythical, distant idea. Like, the idea of like affordable, high-quality housing is like fucking Atlantis to a British person. Another example of something that could be provided under such a framework is lifelong education. Look, I spoke about it earlier, and it is kind of the thing that's annoyed me the most here. But, like, you could provide that. It is important for participation in the society, or legal assistance. I did a video recently about defamation laws in the UK, and one of the big issues was that people couldn't afford legal representation. The provision of that wouldn't just mean that I get to defame people publicly, which would be great fun, and have a lawyer, but it would provide people who are locked out of legal methods to pursue justice a way to at least start doing that, or at least the possibility of doing so. Final example I want to bring up, because I think we get the picture, is public transport. It's not a secret that I get enraged by the quality of trains in the UK, for good reason. They're expensive and terrible, and I feel like you can either be expensive or terrible, but you can't really be both. That's too much even for me. When I was visiting home, it turned out that the buses into town were free on Saturdays, and let me tell you, that fucking ruled. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. Like, the buzz of being waved on the bus by the driver and not having to pay was great. And you know what I didn't care about in that moment? Whether a rich person was getting a free bus ride, because if they were, they weren't driving a car at least, and that's good, actually, which I think is a really positive note to end like the main bulk of the video on. And so I think on that really good note, I'm going to just sort of leave it there. Free buses, always a great point to end on. My main takeaway from the first video of 2024 is that I want to get over the idea that certain things are earned. Everyone deserves, by virtue of being a person, not just the things that they need to live, but the things that enrich our lives. My life is enriched, for example, when someone I know learns about a subject they're passionate about. So why shouldn't they get to learn that when they want to learn it? Or why should someone have to go through a series of ritual tedium and humiliation just to be able to pay their rent? Like, I mean, I don't think landlords should exist anyway, but why do we make people do that? And it's because politicians think that we're assholes. Well, maybe not us, like us, but they imagine the public are assholes because they primarily hear about the public from, I'm gonna blame them, journalists and political advisors. And I do wonder if there's perhaps a correlation at play there. I don't know. I don't know. Look, I'm just saying. The conclusion here is that we have the means to provide all these basic things, and yet we're getting in our own way. Partially because people are accepting far too regularly and across the political spectrum, no one is innocent here, false premises or Trojan horse arguments. Let's stop. Nothing is too good for the working class. It's a good mantra. Another good one is the note that I want you all to take away from this is that everything we do should be for the joy of the people. That's, I think, kind of the vibe for 2024 on the channel. So thanks for sticking with me. Let's go thank some people for stuff. So I need to thank my fantastic graphics guy Emir for the thumbnail. To be honest, at the point that I'm recording it, I haven't seen it yet, but I can only assume it's a banger. I also need to thank my proofreader, which is my partner. So thank you. She doesn't watch the videos, so I don't really know why I do that. Also, I need to thank the patrons and the YouTube member, singular, very intentionally done there. So I need to thank Dronerith, Mercutio, Kazushida, and John N, who are the top tier patrons. And I need to thank Nader Jiwa, who is the only current YouTube member. The Patreon link will be in the description. You can join the channel. There's a Ko-fi for tips. Like, subscribe, all the good stuff. I'm going to get out of your way now and go do some actually productive things, like attend the meeting, because I'm recording this during my lunch break right before a meeting. So see ya, everyone, and I'll be sure to let you know how the meeting goes in the replies.